Okay, so I know since I've started this channel, you have all been waiting for me to have the greatest discussion ever about our most important issue as conservatives: taxes. Taxes are a conspiracy by the white man to deprive us of our wealth. And that's why it's so important as conservatives we say no to King George and his taxes as a conspiracy against our freedom. In 1765, maybe it wasn't the very first, but it's close. So in 1765, the French and Indian War has been won. The British are severely in debt. The French are pulling out of North America, and now we've got a crown that desperately needs money because it's crazily in debt because of constant warfare. The 7 Years' War, or what we call it in the United States, the French and Indian War, has finally come to a close. The British has won. America is on its way to revolution. So we're still 10 years from the revolution, and now we have the British Parliament introducing the Stamp Act. In 1765, the Stamp Act applied to official documents, newspapers, playing cards, any random stuff they could think of from a paper contract perspective that could deprive citizens of their wealth, or in their case, just make up the money for the war. Now, the Parliament's perspective was, well, we won all this land, you have all this prosperity now, what are you doing complaining about paying a few taxes for the army that we had to send to protect you from the evil French and their Indian allies? So they thought they were being perfectly reasonable in putting all these taxes on the American people. We're just a year from the Currency Act of 1764, where they've already deprived Americans of the legitimacy of the banking system creating its own specie or currency. Now we've got the British, who will only accept the taxes if it's paid in pounds sterling, which means we have to use their currency, and they would not accept any currency from US banks for any of this money. So maybe we weren't anti-tax people as much before, but now we're starting to get pissed. And then the British decided to do something to make it easier for us to hate them. The Townshend Revenue Act, which just came a few months after the last act. Now we've got more taxation on goods that are imported from any place except for British imports. These taxes served as a major source of friction between the colonies and the British Empire. And, well, we all know how that turns out, because this is a very, very brief summary of that nightmare scenario. By 1776, we're already mad. We're tired of all these taxes. The tea has been thrown into the harbor. Now let's fast forward. We've won at Yorktown. We finally have a country. 1787, we have a new constitution. 1790, the country's like, wait a minute, how do we raise money again? And that's where we get into our modern tax system as we know it today. The tariff of 1789 was introduced by James Madison, a young congressman from Virginia. I think he was from Virginia. Anyway, a young congressman from Virginia. He was a military veteran who had fought in the war, who had fought in the Revolutionary War, and now as a congressman, he has introduced this tariffs as a way to tax the people without pissing them off too much, because they still have their guns and they're still mad about the king's taxes, and the last thing they want to do is say, well, now that we've won this war about taxes and freedom, we're gonna tax the hell out of you. They would wait a little while before they did that. So once George Washington signs the legislation, it goes into effect in 1790. Only affected foreign goods that were imported into the new United States of America. The government had to pay off its debts, and so they needed a source of revenue because there were, I think, about $34 million in debt. The American Revolution had been very expensive. It certainly cost a lot more to the British oppressors who we had to destroy. And so finally here we are, we have this nation, we have these taxes, we have to have these taxes to generate revenue, and the government functioned rather well on this revenue until 1834. Taxes were paid off. The president cut the tariffs in half. They got rid of all excise taxes, and this is all the revenue that the government lived on until the Civil War. During the Civil War, the federal government in Washington had introduced some income taxation, which is of a dubious legality, over the course of the war years. These income taxes set a precedent for what was eventually going to come in 1913 with the 16th Amendment, which formalized and probably legalized the ability for the federal government to levy an income tax. Since 1913, we've had the progressive income tax has fluctuated back and forth a little bit here and there over the years, going as high as 80%, 90% on the highest income earners, all the way down to about 32% right now for our highest income earners. We've also added a series of taxes along the way, mostly excise taxes, such as a tax on gasoline, tobacco, other sin products that people can typically get away with, and even Kansas, which now has a tax on drugs, illegal drugs. I shit you not. If you're in Kansas, before you buy cocaine, you better make sure there's a tax stamp on it or you could go to jail. Not only are they serious about this excise tax in Kansas, but if you get caught with the drug and you haven't paid the tax, you're going to be liable to fine. Interestingly, people did not voluntarily pay this tax for obvious reasons. In fact, there's only been $720 raised from it by people who bought the tax stamp in advance. But the great state of Kansas has used this to their benefit and collected $500,000 just in 2021 from people who were caught with drugs who hadn't paid the tax. The Kansas law also allows them to seize property or real estate and any assets that the person has in order to pay the tax. So you can imagine if you got caught with a lot of drugs, you're going to lose everything to the tax department. So this is a bit of fascinating history for us. But government using the power of taxation, not just to deprive individuals of their wealth, but to generate revenue for the ever-growing bureaucracy, was a worry of our early founders. They didn't want the government to get too big, which is why they kept the government small and why it was able to operate for so long just on tariffs. You had the very first state income tax in Wisconsin in 1911. Over the course of the 20th century, more and more states started to use the income tax as a way to generate revenue. But in the last decade or so, states, in order to maintain their competitive edge against other states, have slowly started to get rid of their income tax and rely solely on their sales tax. Because states are trying to compete with each other for business, the states that have the lowest taxes have the greatest economic growth. Now, this can be attributed not only to a positive tax environment, but states that go without income taxes are actually generating more money through sales taxes and other means without having to tax their citizens to death. For example, in the state of Ohio, by the time the average worker gets done paying all their taxes, they only have 66 cents for every dollar they make. If you're down in Florida, you still have 89 cents for every dollar that you make. Now, this is really this makes a big difference. And I think one of my liberal hippie friends was just like, well, yeah, Rich, of course, they've got Disney World. They're making billions of dollars off of that. But it's not just Florida. All the other states without income taxes are seeing the same economic benefits of not having that in place. But they do have a little bit of a higher sales tax. But the sales tax is a voluntary tax. If you don't want to pay the 10% tax, don't shop in that state, or just cross the state line to buy the same thing for a little less if you're close. So the ability for states to compete has given us a major advantage in encouraging states to have more friendly tax environments. But one of the problems you get into is that people just want to keep spending and spending and spending and spending, and they don't want to stop, and they think they can just keep taxing the citizens as long as they want, as much as they want. They think these taxes can get as high as possible. And that's where this comes from, which is why it's so important as conservatives, we have to protect the integrity of our government and make sure that we're not just wasting thousands of dollars. So looking for conservative solutions to government spending is a big deal. And it's very important because we don't want a government to get out of control. If we knew that our tax money was being spent well, I really feel that people would have different feelings about how we're taxed. For example, you talk to people in Europe and you look at what they get for their tax revenue in comparison to what we get for our tax revenue. And even though our citizens are very closely taxed, by the time you pay sales taxes, license plate fees, income tax, all these taxes, our taxes aren't actually that much higher than socialist Europe. And look how much better all their services are. I mean, really, their services are so much better. We just don't have an apparatus, I think, in the United States to make sure our money is spent well. We can't trust our bureaucrats to do that, which is why money is better in private hands. As you look into having a conversation about the tax issue, jumping through a little bit of our history and going into a conversation with the average voter, the cost of Democrat policies is so high, I don't think the average voter actually talks about it, which is why if your state party has put together a tax calculator for when you go door to door, you can ask somebody, hey, how much do you make a year? You're a plumber, what are you paying? Here's what it looks like if you vote for the Democrat, right? And they're gonna see right away how much higher their taxes are going to be. So when putting together your talking points to have a conversation about taxation, you have to keep in mind that we don't really trust the government to spend the money because they don't spend it well. Biggest failing school districts, they're spending $12,000 a year per pupil, and the more money they spend, the worse the schools get, but yet they refuse to accept charter schools because they just want to throw more and more money into a system that fails. We can't trust the government to spend our money because they just don't do it as good as we do. You could also argue that we should privatize our roads as well. I will never win that argument if I am in Congress, and I totally get that, but there are better ways, more efficient ways for the private sector to handle a lot of things that we're doing. But of course, we have to accept that we have to have government control over our military. We certainly can't privatize that, and that's something we just need to accept. But otherwise, almost everything else, that every other function of government could easily be done by private individuals. So taxation in America is a really big deal. And when you're looking at having a conversation about our high taxes and what we actually get out of it, we have a major disconnect. For example, Joe Biden's current tax policy is going to spend $1 trillion. How do you say to a taxpayer that we're going to spend $300 million in Pakistan on women's gendered education, for example? Or how are we going to spend $2 million giving women abortions in the middle of Africa? And I know this is a big part of the whole keep the population of the undeveloped world down so that the Western populations aren't overrun. Kind of a conspiracy, actually, that I'll talk about maybe in another video. So there's a couple different directions you go when you're having the tax debate. The one is to make sure you remind the person the pain of the Democrats' tax costs, because if they vote Democrat, they're going to be spending more in taxes. First, you're going to spend more in direct taxation. Secondly, the cost of products will increase because those extra taxes will have a ripple effect on the economy. Thus is caused inflation. The value of the dollar shrinks because it has less purchasing power because the cost of goods is increased as a result of these taxation. And there's a compounding effect on that, which makes us have a lot of problems. The problems that we're having right now with the value of the dollar during this conflict is a perfect example of that. Usually when America goes to war, the economy increases. You should see a major boom in our economy right now, and you're not seeing it because of how screwed up our economy is, because of Biden and the Democrats and their taxation and the energy costs and everything else that's going into it. You want to make sure you have examples of the amount of money that has been spent by your Democrat opponent if they've served in office before. Knowing the record of your opponent, if they've already been in Congress for 2 sessions or been in the state Senate for a session or 2, they voted to increase taxes. What taxes? Where did that money go? Did it go to give special bonuses to people who were union stewards, like what the Democrats did with the Department of Labor last year? Did it go to the big banks? We should know that. Nobody wants those guys, those bastards, getting any more money than they deserve. So talking about the tax issue is going to be really important over the course of the campaign. Making sure you have a good foundation and understanding where these taxes come from and the growth of our bureaucracy is going to be vital to being successful in connecting with voters on this issue. Someone on the left would argue that the taxation is the cost of living in a post-industrial society. It's your entrance fee. If you don't pay these taxes, don't want to pay these taxes, maybe you shouldn't be a part of society. Now, I say, why don't we have a government apparatus that spends our money more wisely? Maybe we wouldn't be so upset about paying taxes. We just can't trust our government to make good decisions. That's $300 million that could have been given back to the taxpayers or could have been spent to repair a bridge or fix a highway or, I don't know, anything. Give everybody a free nationwide homeschool curriculum. Through the Department of Education, for example, could have been done with that money. But it wasn't. It wasn't spent on us. It was wasted. Or maybe even Even if it's a good investment, is it our investment to make? Couldn't charitable organizations have provided those people with that help? Did they really need it? Or is this just another example of a bunch of white liberal Americans deciding they know better than the poor, dirty brown people in a foreign country? Which is what I think the answer is, because that's how those liberals are. But when it comes down to it, the government wastes money. So when you're knocking on somebody's door and you say, aren't you tired of the government wasting your money? I bet you had to pay more in taxes this year than you had to pay last year, because that's how Joe Biden has destroyed our economy. So once you've reminded the voters of these things and having conversations about taxation at the door, you also want to have some ideas as to some things that need to be fixed in your state and your community. So you want to identify state and local budgets as an example of government waste. If you're running for city office or county office, having a look at the finances for your local community would be very eye-opening for you, especially if there's some corruption. You'll find that a lot of local officials will give out contracts for things to their friends or their relatives, or they'll even have LLCs that own LLCs so that they can't trace back to them actually being the receiver of the contracts. So make sure you do your opposition research. So good luck on the campaign. I think I've given you a rattled on long enough about the tax issue. Good luck on the campaign.